So you have a gospel connection with many of your family members, right? And you can help them reframe the way they think about Christ by you sharing your testimony about how you think about Christ.
He is a poet, and he is a preacher, and he is a prophet in the broader historical sense of prophet as one who helps the status quo realize its shortcomings and hopefully strive to be something better. So we have poet, preacher, and prophet, Professor Willie Jennings. We'll turn the time to you now, sir.
And that image is of a white, self-sufficient man who embodies what I call 3 demonic virtues: possession, control, and mastery.
And we can never forget these educated women, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, who are the founders of Black Lives Matter and the women who started this movement that has gone worldwide and has reshaped many things in our society.
The great radical Ambalavana Sivanandan spoke scathingly in the 1980s of the racism awareness training events that became popular at that time, which he said, and I quote, removed state and institutional responsibility for racism, instead turning it into a natural social phenomenon independent of material conditions, a so-called white disease.
In 2016, Dr. Wu won the John Hope Franklin Prize for Best Article on Race, Racism, and the Law, and the Kimberly Crenshaw Outstanding Article Award Honorable Mention.
And today I want to invite you to reflect with me around the themes of my book, After Whiteness, and Education in Belonging. After Whiteness and Education in Belonging.
But they're not the end in themselves. This is not how change happens. They have to translate into political action, into power and policy change in order to be successful. And I think that's a really important message from Kendi's book as we consider how we, according to President Worthen's directive, can put the resources of the university and ourselves into the work of anti-racism, and that it's not a flash in the pan, and that activism is not these big events, and change makers are not those, not accidental activists.
And the kinds of questions, and some of them seem to be around critical race theories. And so I was just wondering if you could talk about what differences you see in terms of the way race is or is not part of public discourse, public concern in Europe in particular, I guess, which is the questions we've had here as opposed to the United States or even your own Australia.
Yeah, that's a really important question, given the attacks on critical race and decolonial thought in France and elsewhere, I might add. UK, for example, very much picking up the Trumpist mantle of going against critical race theory. And I think this is becoming a global phenomenon that I think we have to be really, really wary of.
The books on Black theology, right? If you're interested in that, you can find information on how to get to that in Kendi's book. We need to root ourselves in love and then try to connect people to, I would say, Jesus Christ, especially those that are within our family. And this will be the last thing I'll say. It comes from Kendi's book on page 15 in Definitions. He talks about a way of reframing about how we think about Jesus Christ that was provided by Tom Skinner. So Tom, he was a preacher from Harlem, and he says, Jesus was a radical revolutionary with hair on his chest and dirt under his fingernails. Any gospel that does not speak to the issue of enslavement and injustice and inequality, any gospel that does not want to go where people are hungry and poverty-stricken and set them free in the name of Jesus Christ is not the gospel. So you have a gospel connection with many of your family members, right? And you can help them reframe the way they think about Christ by you sharing your testimony about how you think about Christ.
It's not a white, self-sufficient masculinist presence that always tries to exhibit possession, control, and mastery.
I owe my respect to folks from the Black Panther Party for their development of social programs that have helped to alleviate food insecurity in our nation for years.
Especially the critical race scholar, an Aboriginal woman, Debbie Bargali, with whom I'm working on sort of developing a project on what we actually mean when we say racial literacy and why we need it, what it is and what it isn't, and what it could look like in the future, going toward the dismantling of the racial state of so-called Australia.
We know that some of the dominant hegemonic features of our culture in terms of gender and race, they're nationwide. It's a very suburban population, the LDS population. So you see this. You see a pattern of majority Republican, conservative-leaning vote in state after state. It's not different.
And it just also reminds me of Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a founding scholar of intersectionality, describing, I caught her on the radio, describing how critical race theory is just a tool to try to understand what's happening so that we can do better.
It is this sense of self-sufficiency that showed up throughout the colonial world.
Dr. Alana Lenton is an anti-racist, race-critical scholar who works on the critical theorization of race, racism, and anti-racism. Dr. Lenton just finished a term as the president of the Australian Critical Race and Whiteness Studies Association.
But while a better historical and conceptual understanding of what race does is vital, increasing the public's understanding of race must, I think, be accompanied by a radical reorganization of a society in ways that undo current arrangements of exploitation that maintain and deepen white supremacy.
As a parent, I would encourage you to seriously question these distinctions. Know that play prepares children for life, and children need broad options. Toys are the means by which they practice and acquire the most fundamental motor, cognitive, spatial, social, and emotional skills. But that needed variety is lost when the adults in corporate worlds define some toys as for boys and others as for girls. Provide your children with a range of toys and activities that promote all types of developmental skills, and especially be mindful of the language you use in your home that may convey gendered meanings around their play and their toys. Remember the hot potato effect.
We know that Black Lives Matter and its movement, and especially in terms of Black women like Melody Jackson, Janisha Demise Williams, and many others, led the way. This is way back in 2017 when people were, it seems very quaint now, arguing about somebody kneeling and peacefully protesting Colin Kaepernick.
One last thing I'll say about this sign, this example is, I think there's a fairly good chance that before the vandalism, it was unlikely these young ladies would have stopped to read the sign, to reflect on it, to contemplate its meaning. But because it is further charged by the work of anti-racists.
So how do we talk to our kids about gender? I'm convinced that one of the most effective tools at our disposal, especially for parents of daughters, is feminism.
Rosa Parks, somebody like Rosa Parks, who we think of as this really important figure in the civil rights movement, she wasn't an accidental activist. She was trained.
Dealing with it directly will be helpful. There's been a lot of pushback on critical race theory lately, with people arguing that it is dangerously divisive or anti-American. So what is critical race theory, and how does Kendi's book relate to it?
With a critical eye, they've looked more closely at the foundation of this kind of maybe idea of liberalism, which kind of presumes that there's an existence of a meritocracy and that we're actually living in that system, right? It's based on this ideals of equal opportunity, that individual merit determines your outcomes, that, it's kind of competition on this equal playing field. And that's kind of the basis for what America is. CRT's kind of push back against that. And
gathering must be redeemed. It must be rescued. It must be rescued from the sick gathering that has formed because of whiteness.
This is something that is scary. That is something that should be taken seriously, and is something that has infected a very large fraction of the white LDS population.
I'll just kind of piggyback on Dr. Hadfield's comments about, critical race theory as one tool, and that there are lots of tools. And I think that we have some pretty powerful tools that have come from the church. So this past conference made clear, if it wasn't already clear from what President Nelson and other general authorities have said over the last few years, that this type of work, the work of anti-racism, is a religious imperative. And a number of the brethren and female leaders of the church offered, some ideas that really fit, I think, really well with what Kendi's saying.
Some people that push back view it as a kind of a Marxist postmodern ideology, and that it's a philosophy that separates rather than unifies, which kind of gets to Leslie's question. They view it as Marxist because instead of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the owners and the workers, those terms have been replaced by whites and non-whites. And that combines into a system of oppressor and oppressed. And some of the critiques border on the level of conspiracy. So they kind of invoke Marxism and they give it a new term kind of called cultural Marxism, which comes from a Frankfurt school. Cultural Marxism has its own kind of academic history and traditional theoretical approach. But since the 1990s, we've seen individuals kind of take this and turn it into a global conspiracy, where the goal of cultural Marxism is to destroy Western values and traditions. So like capitalism, authority, morality, patriotism, liberalism.
It's also difficult to disentangle race from the modern capitalist system, and all capitalism, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes, is of course racial capitalism.
In terms of structural oppression and modernity, and of course technologies, things like print capitalism, photography, these have all, and many others, these have all of course been part of that history and that those systems.
I read Dr. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, last year at the end of the summer, and I found it an enlightening experience.
And the first step that you can do is to stop saying, oh, I'm not racist, right? In fact, if you want to spot a racist, that's the first thing they'll do is they say, oh, I'm not racist.
To try to name what is known, but rarely named. And that is the struggle over and the fight with the image of the white self-sufficient man, or more precisely, the struggle over white self-sufficient masculinist intellectual form.
Race is one of those major or master concepts, and he says the masculine form is deliberate.
We're living in the age of Black Lives Matter, which I have a firm commitment is today's civil rights movement.
But it also draws our attention to these young girls who, of course, are too young to have sort of been alive, to have been alive in the context of the Civil War or even the civil rights movement, have probably, I would imagine, very little understanding of their genealogical relationship to slavery, but are nevertheless enmeshed in a society and its structures and institutions and ideas, which are the products of that history.
If we want to get to this new anti-racist BYU, these are things that can get us there, right? So think about that kind of policy-oriented approach to anti-racism.
This individuals that fall back on this liberalism kind of frame race-based issues as in the language of liberalism, so they can appear moral.
Okay, get on board with that kind of stuff. And you can take my word for it, or you can listen to my main man, Russ, here. My main man, Russ, is probably one of the strongest advocates for everything that I just said.
Whiteness is an engine of aspiration.
race, a deep understanding of how it functions and how it continues to reproduce itself should be at the heart of how we approach all other topics.
Has become Black History Month. And this is specifically designed so that Black youth can have an opportunity to learn and think about their positive contributions to history, and to highlight Black role models. Black power advocates from Marcus Garvey to Malcolm X, Angela Davis, and beyond.
You see, something must be given up, or should I say, someone. That old man, my friends, who is a master, who dreams his son in power, dreams his son become the white self-sufficient man. He must die in us in order for another dream to take hold.
So the point here, of course, is that white ignorance is willful. It's not that it isn't true to say that there are individual white people who are not aware, and if they were made aware of race, that they wouldn't change their behavior or work towards anti-racism, but rather that the racial state requires this structural white ignorance.
Sometimes it takes years of effort and work to slowly move somebody into the right direction. And especially with our family members, these people we want to be with eternally and we want to help in this life, it's valuable being gentle as we can, but at the same time being honest and real and true with them. We need to root ourselves in love and then try to connect people to, I would say, Jesus Christ, especially those that are within our family. And this will be the last thing I'll say. It comes from Kendi's book on page 15 in Definitions. He talks about a way of reframing about how we think about Jesus Christ that was provided by Tom Skinner. So Tom, he was a preacher from Harlem, and he says, Jesus was a radical revolutionary with hair on his chest and dirt under his fingernails. Any gospel that does not speak to the issue of enslavement and injustice and inequality, any gospel that does not want to go where people are hungry and poverty-stricken and set them free in the name of Jesus Christ is not the gospel. So you have a gospel connection with many of your family members, right? And you can help them reframe the way they think about Christ by you sharing your testimony about how you think about Christ.